We want to have the title, but it doesn't work now.
No, it's the next slide.
Yeah, to go back.
Yes. No, this is the first slide's on here. Ja, weet ik, maar dit is een extended lecture. Dat is wel helemaal goed.
Où est-ce que je t'en mets? Ah, ici?
Ja, achter ons. Ja, dat is oké. Ja, ja, het is moeilijk, ja. Jawel. So now we don't see the slides which is on.
Is everything is all right? Everything is all right? Shall I start? Yeah? Okay. So it's my pleasure to welcome today here in Bern. Here it's better. We're at the University of Bern. Two colleagues from Red Bull University in Nijmegen, Professor Dr. Inge Bleijenbergh and Marloes van Engen, for a keynote speech on resistance and ignorance, the way toward gender equality in higher education. Both of them are experts and researcher in gender equality, diversity and inclusion, and they also have been working in putting equality, diversity and inclusion in the culture of the universities. In Nijmegen and also in other universities. We will have a talk for more or less 1 hour 45 minutes. After we will have a short break and question will be afterwards. So for the people who are remotely here with Zoom, please stay in the Zoom room. You can write your question in the chat. Or after the break, we will give you the floor for more questions. But if you have questions, just write them down in the chat and we will start with answering the question after the short break. So enjoy it. Inge,
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Very much. Thank you so much for having us here and for the pleasure and the honor. I need to share the screen. We don't do that. Okay. We did do that, and we didn't. Okay.
I thought it would, yeah. Can you do that across the can? Yeah, sure.
So, yes, great. Okay, thank you so much for the honor and the pleasure of inviting us here to talk about a topic close to our heart, gender equality in higher education. And with this invitation, we are invited to also talk about resistance that we encountered in doing research on the topic and in trying to foster change. We are doing a co-presentation since we are 15 years colleagues working intensively on the topic. Here next to me is Dr. Marloes van Engen, Associate Professor Human Research Management at the Nijmegen School of Management. She studied psychology and she has a long track record in meta studies on leadership, on diversity, with expertise in qualitative and quantitative research. But she has also been for 6 years a gender equality officer next to her academic job. So she knows about making her hands dirty as well as sophisticated research.
And here standing next to me is Professor Dr. Inge Bleijenbergh. Inge has is a really renowned scholar. She has written 2 textbooks on qualitative research methods. And in the last 15 years, she has really showed herself to become a real good theorist on action research. But she also not only has been writing on action research, she has also been very active in doing action research, also together with me when I got to know her when I hired her actually for doing action research, yes, in one of the projects. Inge has also been very important in many European projects implementing gender equality in universities, of which I also participated in some of them. And yes, so together we have years of experience in doing these projects. Not only that, since 15 years, we have also got to know each other a lot. So Inge and I have a very different background in theories and research traditions. And I think this diversity in perspectives helped us a lot as well in becoming better change agents, better researchers, better teachers, I think, and also, dear friends.
So thank you, Marloes. That was very kind. So with this invitation by Sabine, we thought we would tell you about our experiences, but we will frame that, of course, around the structure of slides with theories and but we will make sure to give sufficient examples from what we did in our work. So inequality in higher education, what are we talking about when talking about inequalities? Is it clear or something going on? No? Okay, great.
Properly or that?
Yeah, I saw some body language system. Yeah, things are fine. Inequality in higher education, what are we talking about? Are we talking about representation? Are we talking about gender representation, men and women or other genders in leadership positions, or about people of color? Yes, or people with different sexual identities that are publicly known for that? Or are we talking about careers in general? So the possibilities for anyone in the organization to have careers in the direction they aim for and they want to, and have equal chances to do so. And it may have to do with being hired or promoted or getting equal pay. With inequality in higher education, we can also talk about the content of what we're doing in daily life. What are we lecturing? What are we investigating? And is there a gender dimension or an intersectional dimension in research? Do we take into account sufficiently the relevance of race, of class, of gender, of sexual orientation, and understanding our knowledge about society? Do we, in the teaching, accommodate people with different identities sufficiently, and do they have role models in the teaching, or do they find examples that resonate with their daily life and experiences? With inequality or equality, we can also talk about social safety, the ability to have the identity that suits you, and that you don't have to hide your sexual orientation or your background because you feel unsafe or threatened or are afraid to be harassed. So that's equality. When we talk about perspectives on gender equality, there are many different ways to understand what equality is. Gender scholars have a tendency to look at outcomes, equal outcomes, think about pay, and looking for like material equal pay for people who identify as women and as men. But you can also look at equal processes, which is a very popular approach in many businesses. Like people will have equal chances to get somewhere, and if there are not equal outcomes, at least we offer them equal opportunities. So that's very different. We can think about the legal term, equal treatment. We will treat everyone the same way. But here you have to think about when starting positions are not equal or needs are different, then equal treatment will finally end up in unequal situations. There's also a talk, and that's very popular in the United States, about equity. means more like equal value to people with different backgrounds, and that is revaluing differences, and maybe a way to reconsider the norms that we use for treating people the same way. So when it's about gender equality perspectives, there are differences in goals. Where do we want to go, giving people equal opportunities or equal outcomes, but also values. Do we value masculinity and femininity at the same level, or is there a hierarchy in these values? These types of equality also foster different types of resistance, especially the equal outcomes approach may evoke resistance if you strive for it, and the equal treatment as well. If you want to do something extra for marginalized groups, people may have resistances on the basis of their reference to equal treatment. Organizational change. Yeah, I give the floor to Marloes. No, that's the next one. Sorry. Okay, organizational change. When do you want to change organizations in the direction of being more fair, more just, more safe for people of different genders and with different intersectional identities? There's a key role for the leadership, because they are the role models. They showcase what are important values in the organization. We know from gender equality and from diversity research that it's important that leaders in organizations are problem owners. So like what we discovered in our own cases, like after long process of struggles with rectors or deans, when finally they became problem owners, they could really speed up the process because they gave interviews and they showcased publicly equality counts for us. We don't want to go back to the old days.
Yeah. So as Inge said, it's often that we have this leadership in the top support, and they really value these, can sometimes really value and support you in equality initiatives. But then you may find it actually does not land in the organization. And we encountered that, for instance, in my previous university, but also in other universities. So the rector would come to me and say, okay, now we have installed all these practices, we have installed the structures and the procedures in place, but nothing happens. What can we do? And what often happens is that the ones in the schools, the ones on the work floor, the supervisors, the department chair, so the ones who are the gatekeepers, the key stakeholders, they are not so invested as the executive boards that we have been talking to so much. So we need to have this ownership trickle down the organization. And the ownership, as Inge already mentioned, is really important, that people feel that equality or inequality is an issue that they need to solve, that they need to be problem owner of. And one of the means that you can do that is by participatory modeling techniques or participatory interventions. So we used in a couple of universities and a number of schools, we used one specific kind of participatory modeling where we invited all the stakeholders to the table and first define the problem. So what is inequality? What are the consequences of inequality? What are the causes of inequality? And by that we have knowledge mobilization. We also ask them, so what their perspectives are, and they get together and talk about it. Then you see discussions, understand. Not everybody is agreeing on what diversity is, or whether it's needed, what inequality is, or whether it's needed, or what the outcomes are, or the consequences are. And in these sessions where you sit together, what the aim is that you have that you come to a shared understanding of the problem, which is really complex and multi-layered, multifaceted on levels of individual level, structural level, even societal level. And what you want to have is a joint frame of reference that then helps to find levels of change. But also, if participatory modeling, what you also want is commitment from these managers or down in the organizations for the changes to actually happen. And we actually saw that happen. So I've been a diversity manager, as Inge mentioned, for 5 years, not so much. Lots of things happened, obviously, but I got really commitment of the leaders, and even they were more radical than anything I could ever present by using this system dynamics modeling. So yeah, so yeah, then what then happens is that you turn a little bit roles around. If you are leading such a participatory modeling intervention, the facilitator gives the floor to the participants in the room. They are then actually the problem owners. So it's what they come up with, their frames of reference that makes the change happen. And people become, instead of being change recipients, so the targets of our policies and practices that we had in place, they become the owners of the policies and practices and even invent them themselves. And that kind of gives them ownership of the problem, and also they want to get through the intervention in the end as well. So the follow-up of the intervention is more successful. And here what you can see is that what Inge called as well, it's an interplay between knowledge and effect. And so you want people not only to be knowledgeable, just sending and acquiring information on what to do, but you also want that they are passionate about what they do, or that they are emotionally invested in change processes. But you also do not want people only to be emotionally invested in actions, but also use tools that are help in this context. So use evidence-based management principles. So do reviews on what practices help. Do reviews on what actually in your specific context is the problem and what needs to be tackled. So that's really nice about participatory modeling, that you kind of have everybody in the room on board in thinking about what the problem is, the causes, the consequences. Yeah. Yes. So what really helps is that you can kind of think of, say, if you're interested in the representation of women in top position, that women get there from middle positions, and women in middle positions get there from low positions. So this is what we call in system dynamics a stocks and flow model, just how people go through the organization.
And we make that for men as well.
Yes, so this one is one for women, and then we make a similar one for men. And then we start to build in this participatory modeling technique. We start to ask people in the room by nominal group technique, what do you think affects this this process here? And then people may come up with all kinds of explanations, really a lot. And then we try to list them and see whether we can get agreement that everybody says, yes, that's an issue, and it goes in that direction and that direction. So for instance, here we see hiring of women. When the percentage of women that are hired is higher, then we have more women in middle management, more women in leadership positions. More women in leaderships means that the proportion of women leaders increases. So there is a possibility of more women in selection committees. So then we also know from selection committees, if you have a woman instead of no women, it's about 4% extra women that are hired. For two, it's about 12%, research from Marieke van der Brink. And if it's more, then it's even 22%. So it's not that similar people attract similar others. It's that when there's somebody dissimilar in any kind of identity in a selection committee, people start to think a little bit more outside the box in looking at candidates and evaluating. Evaluating the criteria more thoroughly instead of going on their gut feeling. So this is an example of a feedback loop that is reinforcing, and so this process makes it it's like a cycle upwards. Yes, which is interesting. So when some time ago we went to a STEM university, and where we also did this participatory modeling. But before we went into the modeling session, we also gave them the numbers. So here on the slides you can see the 4 years later for men, and 4 years and 4 years later, and 8 years later for women. On the slide, you don't need to look at the slide. But what's really interesting is to look at the yellow arrows, and the yellow arrows are people that get promoted. And according to this university, the formal policy on paper is that no internal candidate ever can get a promotion.
PhD candidates to be.
Yeah, postdocs.
Yeah.
Yes, but also for the higher levels, they needed to go to abroad to another university before returning to the university.
And we're talking about academic staff, so
Yeah.
not about support staff, and we're talking about the temporary positions, the move from that positions to a tenured position.
Yeah, but this is actually the entire staff in 2000 and 2004 and 2008, and you can see, for instance, that 32 people are here, an associate professor, and still 35 over here. 10 left the university, 4 new ones were hired, and this yellow is very interesting. These are 5 that are internally promoted in the organization. So what we could show here to the deans is, well, you say you don't have internal promotion, but actually that's true for women. Only 1 is here, and that's not true for men. So we have the structures in place that we don't want people from internal to have for innovation. We don't want internal promotions, but half of the higher positions are actually internal. And then when we went back with that question with the professors and said, hey, but how is it possible that that there's an exception to this rule? And then they would say, like, well, but this professor, we would lose him to Germany, and he's such a brilliant scholar, and we really need to keep him. And then I said, yes, but you just told me as well that this brilliant woman who had this grant, big grant, and she had this also this how do you call it, the in STEM a patent. She also had a patent which was really highly influential or what have you, and she can't stay. And then Leslie said, oh yes, but she had to abide by the rules. We can't have promotion. So it's really interesting that that you get the conversation going on. And so the resistance was, well, our formal policies did describe the reality. So this cannot be true what you showed here. But then when you start investing in dialogue, and so yes, but let's go to look at the data. Actually, they are there. It's had effects, but we have to talk about itself. All right. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Then another one of such feedback processes, and that's about networking. So when we work with groups in understanding what's going on in their organizations, again and again, they come up bottom up spontaneously with understanding that networking is important as well. So this is not only about formal hiring, this is also about informal processes taking place. Informal processes through which people hear about, for example, jobs, or through which they were hired to replace someone who is on pregnancy leave, for example. These jobs don't get in the formal system, or informal networking where people are invited to speak on a conference or to do a prestigious thing that helps them in their careers. So if the effectivity of networks of women increases, that also influences their upward careers. But these networks are very much influenced by the proportion of women that are part of leadership. So networking is always helpful for diversity, but as soon as women in leadership positions are part of the networks, they are more effective in promoting people or giving them prestigious jobs or talks or money. So that's something we found with working with stakeholders and organizations. And then when we presented the results, there was resistance in several ways. For example, when we told them, okay, you should invest in networking because we learned from you and your organizational members how important this is, they said, yeah, but we can't organize this networking. We can't, of course, have networks only for women, or we can't have networks only for colored people. That would be excluding many people in an organization, and they would object to that. There was also resistance, and I noticed that myself and extra research in my own university, where we were setting up a women's network in the university, and the existing network of full professors, of female full professors, was feeling threatened and like really, yeah, opposing that there would be an additional network. They were elder generation feminists. They had been working quite hard in a very difficult surroundings to get to their positions, and now these young women were willing to have another network. also with very different means, a lot of social media that we used, a lot of like very interactive meetings. So what we did to finally overcome that resistance was working hard with them. And actually, we were a mixed group of people setting up the networks, and we consciously chose to make the very younger ones the chair, the secretary, and the penningmeester, the in charge
The
of
treasurer. Yeah.
treasurer. So they would go to the elderly women's meeting, to the full professors network, and they were so much younger that the full professors got protective and a little bit like, okay, you are nice. And they very consciously were modest, like, can you give us advice? Can you help us? Because you have much more experience than us. And finally, they connected, and we had a good, very good cooperation in the end. With regard to the resistance to having women's only networks, we decided to show that men were welcome to our meetings, and they still are, but always when they support the goal, the objective of the network. So if you would like to go there to have harsh debates, please do that in another place. But if you are just willing to be with us in listening to lectures or discussing issues, very, very welcome. And always some men come.
Yeah, so one of the things in another network that we used, we thought bring your own men. So whenever we had happenings, everybody was invited to bring one other person, ideally another man. So that there was this women's network, but men were explicitly invited, and in that way got connected.
Yeah, so this is all about building allyships with men or between generations, and still having formal structures, formal networks. In the end, we got sponsorship from the boards, and that worked quite well. Another process that we discussed with stakeholders in the organization was the ideal worker. The ideals about who is an ideal worker, how should she or he behave according to the organizational culture. And that ideal worker shifts between organizations. So in the technical universities, that was much more a practice or applied person than in the humanities universities. Having connections with society was much more important in technical universities than it was in the classical ones. But there was always an ideal worker. And the common thing about that was that women didn't fit the ideal. That was a rhetoric that was repeated anytime. So in the technical universities, they said, we have good women, but they're not that practical. They are so ivory tower oriented. And in the classical universities, they said, yeah, we have good women, but they are like, they are so applied. They like to make connections with society. We need them to be more theoretical. So the common thing was the othering of the women, and the idea, the stereotype that they wouldn't fit the ideal worker. Ideal. So if there is a larger, I'm not there yet.
Yeah. Okay.
If there is a larger proportion of women leaders in organization, that may affect the ideal of a white male worker and make it at least less prominent. That was what we agreed upon. So more diversity in people in important positions, less prominence of that idea that the ideal worker is reproduced in the career trajectories. Yeah, so no, the resistance to the norm of the ideal worker. Good.
Yes, take over, please.
So indeed, I think it's also what Inge also mentioned is that you see how key it is to actually do this participatory modeling, not at a central level, and I think, okay, we then use it for the entire university. We really need to contextualize it. Even in our own humanities university, each school had such different norms, such different ways of framing a masculine identity that you really need to be doing this participatory modeling with people in such a context, in this small context. Now this one, I'm now going to take a little bit of a sidetrack in, but also looking at the the masculine image of the ideal worker, but then from the criteria that were used in remuneration and promotion systems in my own university. So we did on consecutive years a study on pay inequality, and it was quite huge. So it was 1,200 euros in 2004, and I did it in 2018 again, and it was still 1,200 euros a month uncorrected, and corrected for age, for position that people are in, corrected for number of publications, for corrected for years in service. It was still more than 250 euros a month that women earned less than men for the same work. So the university really wanted to do something about that. So said, what can you do? So we started investigating the processes, how pay allocation took place. So who are the decision makers? What are the decisions based upon? So we had both 2 years of cases of new hires, and checked all the documents and asked the employee, the HR manager, as well as the chief, as the supervisors, how did you establish the criteria? How did you establish the salary? What were the criteria used, and what was the salary that was based, what was based upon? And we held interviews with the deans, HR staff of the school, and asked them about these processes. And interestingly, they would start a conversation with, well, we have very strict structure. The processes are really equal. As we have this university functioning system, and we just look up what the experience is there for research, for education, and that we apply, and we don't bend the rules. And then we would ask them, so what was your last appointment? And then we say, oh yes, well, that was an exception. And so we analyzed these data, and we showed actually that there was no transparency of the criteria, because whoever you asked, the criteria was slightly different. There was no university on the application of the criteria. How do you use it? In what order? Or over the years, there was inconsistency over the years. And there was also no consistency between how the different actors that are involved in pay allocation and also in promotion were talking with each other. So it was really interesting, and we wrote up the analysis and gave it back to the persons we interviewed and asked them, can you please comment about it and suggest interventions for change? And I thought they were really great, because we really literally cited them with kind of awkward things, but they took it and said, okay, yes, we now can see that there's something wrong and we really need to do something. So by asking them to write with us on the report, they actually started changing things along the way. And so they've been changing things along. So involving stakeholders in reporting of analyzing, and also when they wanted, ask, how did you do this analysis? Invited them to the table, that I can show you how we did it. That really helped. And also asking advice for their levels of change also helped them to be committed to actually do something about the pay gap.
Yeah. Okay, and then one of the final processes, this is really a dance that we do all the time, changing role models. The presence of role models is a process that all the stakeholders came up with. How important it is when you are a student in a higher education institution that you see someone like you in front of the audience. We had a female PhD of color telling us even last week how important it had been that a full professor was there with refugee background, a female full professor that was lecturing her, and that was the first time in her university career that she thought, oh, I may be getting there as well. So role models are very important, and having more role models is of course influenced by the proportion of women leaders, but also the proportion of people of color that are in leadership positions. Of course, it's also influenced by what the university does do with the communication and with showcasing people on their websites, showcasing them on public lectures and in information material. When you would advise on role models, there are resistances that happen in many organizations, and maybe yours as well. What we noticed, for example, what I noticed in my own STEM faculty in my own university, where I was doing an extra research project for 4 years, is that yes, of course we know we need role models. Of course, we need role models for our women so they know they can do math. But candidates are simply not there. We look for them, but they are not there. Or they said, yes, we found one finally, but she even didn't want to apply. So then the resistance is like giving back the lack of role models to the individuals that are not there. It's a deficit. And then we do everything we can, but they fail. And strategies to overcome that are to look for role models for people from marginalized groups with a different perspective in mind, maybe with a little bit more open mind, because they were looking for candidates that fitted all their criteria, which was sometimes very focused, very narrow-minded, and they had to be that sheep with 5 legs. But when they were looking for people that maybe not have that atypical straight academic career, but had some experience in practice-based research or in industry and still would meet the same criteria, they would find them. So it has to do with like flipping around the type of candidate that you look for and be a little bit creative about whom to hire. What also helped a lot, and that happened in the technical university that we did action research ourselves, is that you sometimes open up positions for a particular group. And that had to be legally carefully framed, but it was possible. And in that case, it was opening up 10 positions for women in a technical university, in a university where 100 people were hired per year, so 10 exclusively for women, and they could underpin that by saying, we are so much behind. We really need to do something to address that. With these 10 positions, 150 very good letters came in from all over the world. And they were finally able to hire 20 of them, because some of them just fitted with regular positions or with other positions they were looking for candidates as well. But the fact that these candidates from all over the world understood they were looking for people like them helped them to apply. So there was no single downgrading of criteria. It was rather opening up positions for a group that felt invited finally. And that changed like the way they looked at the availability of candidates.
Yes, and talking about big groups, and the exact example that Inge showed, they not only hired 20 women, they then found out that these were brilliant women and were very able to get grants and what have you. So 2 years later, they did another round, and 2 years later, they did another round. So it's really interesting that first they had opposition. Inge and I had to go to court actually to defend this equal opportunity program.
Yeah, we were not in front of court, but we were like the experts that were advising on the court case against the university.
Yes.
Yeah.
And because we could show that there was this figures of backlash for not representation for many years, and they tried all kinds of nice other not so influential tactics and that actually said, okay, in this case it's allowed. But what was very interesting is that resistance completely disappeared after these rounds of that we had for these full positions, and they kept doing it. And
the numbers increased.
Yes.
Yeah. So when it's about equality in higher education, it's important to think about feedback effects. So where are reinforcing processes? If you have hardly any people of color in certain positions, it's so difficult to get them in. So you have to start somewhere. And reinforcing processes reconfirm inequalities. So from these analysis that we did with stakeholders, we learned that it is important to invest in the proportion of women and international staff or people of color or with the different ethnic background in application committees, at least 2 of them, preferably more. That you have to invest in formal networks with support of the university structures, with financial means, with providing them with room, because exchanging informally is an important source of power, of empowerment. It's important to invest in role models, not only in numbers, but also to showcase them. And it's important to be aware of the culture of the ideal worker that is so framed about white masculinity, And if people are aware of that, they may be able to think outside the box. Finally, proportions are relevant. Of course, it's always like, where do we wait for, but proportions of people represented in positions do have an effect. So what we would recommend is to have development of systemic knowledge, gender and diversity knowledge, understanding how a system works, how it's not like the responsibility of individuals to change stuff, but that individuals, every individual is influenced by how a system works, in expectations about ideal workers, but also in informal networking. What we learned by working with participants is that they very often know some things about the issue, but this knowledge is scattered. So they know something about stereotypes, or they know something about role models. And when you set them together and try to visualize what they know and to discuss about it, that comes connected, that knowledge, and they integrate it in their own mental model. They are able to then identify where knowledge may help them to formulate actions, to develop action plans. A participatory approach is always helpful. I think the examples Marloes gave, we have been working with Monique together. Yes. Participatory methods are helpful, so not only modeling, but for example, the type of exercises we did this morning by discussing stuff or involving people in redesigning remuneration systems, involving them in thinking about what's going on, what is the problem, what are potential solutions. They become problem owners, and they will be more inclined to also support the implementation and to go beyond paying lip service to the issue. So that is what is helpful about participatory techniques. Do you want to give the final slide, or shall I do it?
No, just go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So it's helpful to have a systems perspective on inequality processes. And what I like a lot is with the discussion about racism, there's now a lot of mention to the systemic aspects of that. And I think it's a long time ago that has been part of the public awareness. What is important is the involvement of stakeholders, and with stakeholders you can be really broad. So when we talk about higher education, that is students, student groups, that is of course staff, and not only academic staff, but support staff as well. I think your examples very clearly show how support staff are essential in redefining systems, and we did that in the science faculties as well. Stakeholders may also be trade unions or works councils, people that are elected to represent the university staff, and of course the leadership.
And sometimes even beyond that. So sometimes local governments or national governments or European legislation also can help boost making the case and the urgency for doing something. Or for finances. So Switzerland is no longer participating in the Horizon 2020 grant, so I've heard, but they are really specific on the gender balance and in the researchers that apply.
That's true. Yeah. When you involve stakeholders, it's important to involve them in understanding what's going on. That may be scary for a researcher. Actually, I experience that sometimes myself. I'm there as the expert and I'm asking them, what is the problem here? And they come up with all kinds of like stereotypical answers to the problem. And I have to step back and to provide them with the opportunity to exchange. And the good thing, there's always someone who says, yes, okay, women may have a lack of confidence, but don't take into account, role models have an influence on them. I'm happy because then we are entering the perspective of how structures influence how people individually feel and behave. So yes, they should be involved in the diagnosis, but also in like what policies can we design, and preferably also in the implementation. So in my own school, we set up a gender equality and later on equality and diversity committee with equal amounts of men and women from the STEM school involved in monthly discussing how the policies were implemented, where there were issues, where things were stalling. And they really became like, this is our policy and we are like standing for it. And in their own like departments, they would advocate it and also educate each other. What I think Marloes' example shows very well is how important it is in all cases to continue dialogue when there's resistance by stakeholders. And yeah, we experienced that several times. Sometimes people get really angry. It's the privilege of the people in power that they are allowed to publicly be angry when you present them with results that they don't like. And then, wow, that takes a lot of energy to deal with that.
Yeah.
The only way we could do that was by doing that together.
Yes.
And by supporting each other before and after meetings. Also when we were sleeping badly and were like red hot of anger because they didn't they suspected our analysis of being fraud or whatever.
Yes.
But yeah, to be honest, we always succeeded in the end to convince them that the analysis was correct.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, so the last point is stamina. We're going to talk about that as well, but also in dialogue, stamina does help. It sometimes feels like endless. It's also why I ended after 6 years that, okay, another dean, I have to start all over
where you
again.
ended with being a gender policy officer.
Yes,
and
indeed.
continued full-time in academia.
Yes, true. Yes, so because I like the dialogue. You get into very interesting conversations, and the most fierce one that gave us the sleepless nights way back was also one of the fiercest change agents afterwards, and is to this day. But it takes a while. And I also remember one of the other deans approaching me later, a couple of years later, that we did one of these participatory modeling session, and I said, "Oh, Marloes, we have to start all over again. I have all new chairs, and they really don't get it. So we need to go do this entire process again." So that's really about stamina. You have to. It's not something which it will. Yeah, when something is changed. It's changed forever.
Can you come next to me? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I'm walking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
There you go.
Yeah. So to address these like really frustrating processes, it's important to, I think, to recognize how emotionally exhaustive this work can be. And I think one of the participants this morning in the workshop mentioned that as well. And you can only address it by supporting each other, recognizing it, and sometimes really like giving each other a hug or just recognizing how frustrating it is.
And celebrating
the small successes.
or big ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much. We're happy to have questions from the audience. Thank you.
Can we now switch off the PowerPoint?
Yeah, you can stop your share.
Oh, stop share.
Can you the red button?
There's no red button.
I don't see it now. Here now. Zoom.
Okay, or maybe we can fit it in the break.
Yeah. Oh yes, true.
So because we will take the answer after break, we will stop the recording. And people who are at home, you had your microphone turned out by Fleur or by Joël, I don't remember, Joël. And for the next part, you will be able to take the floor. We will open your mic when you will ask for the floor. But you can also write your question in the chat during the break, and we will try to have a look at the question and answer the questions first, and after open the floor to the people here and to the people